It won't come as a surprise to learn that GB News doesn't support the railway strikes. And to promote the view that nobody else does, they did an interview with a taxi driver. From the question they ask, it's clear they assumed he would slag off the strikers. But take a look at what happened next.
It's tough times for the taxi drivers, and it's even tougher times now that these rail strikes are going to put a squeeze on your trade.
Yeah, first and foremost, I want to say that the men and women of the train unions are totally 100% back them. They have a right to stand up for the working rights. And it's unfortunate that we don't have more unions that are strong enough to stand up for that. I'm an ex-coal miner myself, so I believe in the union structure. But yeah, I totally support them. If it has to bite on us, then so be it. You know, we're prepared to do that. You know, we made a stronger stuff around these ports.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks for talking to me.
It's a tough time for taxi drivers, and I'm sure it's going to get tougher when the railway workers go on strike. To be fair, I'm not even sure why that's true, because presumably more people are going to take taxis when the trains don't work. But anyway, we'll leave that to one side. He assumed that taxi driver was going to say, oh, yes, I can't believe they've gone on strike in a time that was already difficult to me. He says, actually, no, I understand trade unions. I used to be a miner. I'm absolutely in favour of people taking strike action to defend their pay. He's like, okay, thanks. Thanks for speaking to us. See ya. He didn't want to ask any more to that guy. That was not the guy he wanted to speak to on GB News. Barnaby, obviously, you know, I love seeing clips like that. Obviously, the whole dominant narrative in the media is trying to divide the people in the RMT, railway workers, and people who use the railways, or any other worker whatsoever. So it's RMT versus the world, not it's RMT versus the bosses. But it's great when so many people have basically, you know, seen through that lie.
Yeah, the funny thing about that interview, the confusion in the face of the interviewer, is that, of course, a minute ago, people like that taxi driver were heroes of the right-wing press. They were constructed as honest working-class people. The Tories said they were now the party of the working class. One MP even suggested changing their name to the Workers' Party because they were trying to prosecute a culture war in which they claimed to defend working-class people who were threatened by basically other poor people who were darker than them or more desperate than them, or from various different minorities. And so here the emptiness of that Tory talk of championing workers is really revealed. Workers are championed only when they are subservient, when they're glad to be workers and doff their caps, when they're deferential, when they're celebrating the Queen, or attacking poor people on benefits, or poor people who are refugees, or anyone who's trans. When it's about standing up for themselves, for a better life, against the profiteering wealthy, workers then, of course, become villains, terrifying. And you see that the spectre of evil groups against which the whole of the society must defend itself in a moral panic can easily apply to workers, even if they're white, just as it can apply to refugees and to LGBT people and to Muslims and so on. So workers even become disloyal to the nation when they go on strike. The Telegraph, the Daily Telegraph, accuses the RMT of being in league with Putin. Well, we hear sometimes about a choice between class politics and identity politics, including on the left. Really, you can have an identity politics of anything, or what we used to call on the left, an emancipatory politics, a politics that dreams of freedom. You can have an identity politics of class, just as you can of race or gender, a politics that says, I'm a worker, that's all I ever want to be, I want to doff my cap to the boss and do as I'm told. Or an emancipatory politics of class, just as you can of race and gender, that says, I'm a worker, I'm exploited in the workplace, I am talented and skilled, and I do crucial work that keeps society afloat, but I don't want to be dominated, alienated, exploited, oppressed every day when I go into the workplace by a boss and by a free market that can lob me out of a job any moment. I want instead to have control over the conditions of my livelihood. That is the kind of politics of class. That's the kind of politics of working class histories and traditions that taxi driver knows because he was a miner, and that the Tory party will never, ever understand.
That GB News interview came just as the RMT confirmed that the largest rail strikes in 30 years will now go ahead. Here's General Secretary Mick Lynch.
Faced with such an aggressive agenda of cuts to jobs, conditions, pay and pensions, the RMT has no choice but to defend our members industrially and to stop this race to the bottom. The strikes on Network Rail, the train operators and London Underground will go ahead, and we again call on our members to stand firm, support the action, mount the pickets and demonstrate their willingness to fight for workplace justice. The RMT supports the campaign for a square deal for all working people in the face of the cost of living crisis. And our current campaign is a part of that more general campaign that means that public services have to be properly funded and all workers paid properly with good conditions. We remain available for discussions during the action and after the action and between the strike dates if the companies want to engage with us. But we are firmly of the belief that the only way for us to settle this dispute is for Grant Shapps and the government to allow these companies to negotiate and let the parties reach a reasonable agreement that will end the disruption of the service, will secure jobs and allow a decent transport system to be developed in this country.
Lynch went on to squarely lay the blame at the government's door.
To be fair to the companies, we have kept up cordial relationships with the employers all the way through this. But what we have come to understand is that the dead hand of this Tory government is all over this dispute. And the fingerprints of Grant Shapps and the DNA of Rishi Sunak are all over the problems on the railway and indeed the problems in this society. And until they allow these employers to negotiate freely, I can't see that we're going to get a settlement to the issues that are in front of us.
That was very poetically put. Later in the House of Commons, Transport Secretary Grant Shapps made this statement.
We're now less than 8 hours away from the biggest railway strike since 1989. A strike orchestrated by some of the best paid union barons, representing some of the better paid workers in this country, which will cause misery and chaos to millions of commuters. And Mr. Speaker, this weekend, we've seen union leaders use all the tricks in the book to confuse, to obfuscate, to mislead the public. Not only do they wish to drag the railway back to the 1970s, they're also employing the tactics of bygone unions too, deflecting accountability for their strikes onto others, attempting to shift the blame for their action that will cause disruption and will cause damage to millions of people, and claiming that others are somehow preventing an agreement to their negotiation.
So there's Grant Shapps accusing unions of failing to take responsibility for their actions and of shifting blame to other people. Of course, this is a line that suits the government very well. It deflects from their own failures while building animosity to the unions amongst the public. But it turns out that Shapps is just lying. And Paul Waugh, writing in The Eye, brought the receipts. He reports, now, sources within the train operating companies, the TOCs, that run services on behalf of the Department for Transport have revealed that talks are deadlocked because they are not being allowed to properly negotiate with the RMT. Under the franchise model that had operated since the industry was privatised in the 1990s, rail firms were individually able to set detailed pay awards along with work terms and conditions. But the COVID pandemic's huge hit to passenger numbers led Transport Secretary Grant Shapps to scrap the model and replace it with a system where the state effectively controls the railways by paying a flat fee to firms that kept services running. In the process, individual rail companies have been left in a state of limbo when it comes to negotiating disputes with unions. So why did Shapps change the model? Well, because Rishi Sunak told him to. So they say the government wants the railways to reduce costs by about 10%. A $4 billion annual taxpayer subsidy became roughly $12 billion in COVID years, and the Treasury has said that rail subsidy must be slashed. That was Paul Waugh in The Eye. And apparently it's not just the unions that are unhappy about this. The rail companies hate it too. A source told The Eye, we are in talks with the RMT, but I can understand the union getting frustrated because all we are allowed to talk about is the overall boundaries. None of the TOCs have been given a clear mandate to negotiate detailed pay rates. If we get the right reforms to weekend working practices we want and the union engage on staffing levels, I reckon we could hammer out a deal on pay. Without a mandate from government, we can't even address the pay question. Barnaby, so it seems that the Tories are being pretty duplicitous here. They're saying in public, this is just the unions gagging for a fight. They're being offered a pay rise. Why are they complaining? At the same time, they've got government ministers going out saying, no, they can't possibly get a pay rise because that would be inflationary. And all while this is going on, you've got the people who actually, run the rail companies, who I'm not normally particularly sympathetic towards, saying, if the government just kept out of this, we probably could come to some kind of deal.
It is so depressing. I mean, let me put it this way. Public transport ought to be key to a green transition. So rather than cutting 2,000 jobs, as Network Rail have threatened to the RMT, rather than forcing an 8% real terms pay cut, because we've got inflation, onto low-paid cleaners and highly skilled engineers who have all had real pay cuts for 3 years in a row, rather than all of that, we should be rolling out new railways everywhere as part of a strategy to make travel easier and less carbon intensive. So this strike is a kind of image of a government that thrashes around in chaos rather than grasping the big challenges of our times. You know, they chase headlines putting electronic tags on refugees in the hope of winning votes by attacking the most desperate people. They chase headlines by scapegoating low-paid workers who are desperately needed for a climate transition because they have no answers for an age of entwined economic, social, and ecological crisis. But part of the tragedy here is that no politician in Britain today is proposing the kind of bold strategy, at least no leading politician, not Boris Johnson and not Keir Starmer, the kind of bold strategy that would pay workers well to do the work we need done to transition our economy and our society to face challenges of catastrophic climate change. Those answers aren't coming from above. They're not coming from the top. Our whole party politics is stuck in a kind of staid moderation. Without a state project to solve these problems, people have to take things into their own hands. People can't rely on government to sort it for them. People have to do things like going on strike to ensure they get decent pay and decent conditions. That's why it's not just RMT members, it's teachers in the NASUWT, it's nurses, it's posties in the CWU. All of these groups are now talking about preparing to ballot for possible industrial action, for possible strikes, because they know that's the only way, by fighting back themselves, that they can get decent pay and decent conditions. And if they don't act, even though it will be inconvenient for lots of people, if they don't act, we'll continue to spiral into a society where a tiny clique of the wealthy few get all of the resources, and inflation is used to launch a stealth class war, further impoverishing most of our society. The unions then aren't just causing some temporary inconvenience, they're also the only bastion in defense of the 99% against a very small wealthy clique. And so I think we should salute the RMT today.
All of us here at Novara Media are working harder than ever to keep scrutinising establishment politicians and the media barons who protect them. We don't have billionaire funders. We don't have advertising partnerships. We're funded entirely by you. If you've ever thought about supporting us, now's the time to go to novaramedia.com/support and donate anything you can from just £1 per month. Defy the corporate media. Join our monthly supporters and help build our supporter base to 10,000 strong.